Hello everyone! Today we are going to be reviewing how to play Scorch. Nah, I'm just kidding, it's museum. This is everyone's favorite... It's museum. I don't got a good introduction for this stage, if I'm being honest. The most defining feature of the stage is the spinners. Pretty interesting gimmick that heavily buff Sprinkler and allow for occasional jumps across the plat, but aren't too impactful on how to actually win the stage. Instead, what its most defining feature is from a competitive lens is this giant zone. I think this might be one of the largest sections of one-way drop in the entire game. It reminds me a lot of Scorch Gorge, and I'm not a fan of Scorch, so this isn't a very strong start to the stage. In other modes they fix this, but in zones, which is the focus of this series, this is what we have to deal with. Museum does have an interesting strength, though, which is that it is a very, very wide stage. What this has that Scorch doesn't is the distance between its furthest points that you can attack from are incredibly different. Museum also has something that's very unique to it, though I guess Urchin more recently, since it was added, is also something that can do this, but I still think it's primarily better with Museum, which is that you can spawn jump all the way over here, and basically immediately flank bottom right. It is exceptionally easier to get into this lower part of this map and get to this valuable side angle very quickly out of spawn. That's something that's very unique to this stage. In fact, sometimes you can even have multiple people do this if the other team is heavily committed on your plat. It is occasionally an option you will see people do to try and get around it and take space in the middle of the stage to subvert it. But I think I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let's start with the really defensive terrain that we have here. Typically, Museum can actually be both very defender-favored and very attacker-favored. The main thing that gives it props for attacker-favored is this spinner area, mainly the fact that these spinners provide a whole lot of natural cover from defensive positions, way more than almost every other stage at this point. It's because you can just simply hide on these very tall walls, you can occasionally cross into this side of the map, you can put things like Big Bubbler on the back of the grates, you can just use this entire thing to be able to hide behind, and it can be incredibly difficult to move attackers if they push this far into the base. So it's actually really important in this map to really try and limit the amount of times your opponents can cross over this gap, because this is really the only way they have to get across, and if they ever get across, it will usually hurt quite a lot. Now, Museum's counterbalance to this, outside of this right flank that we talked about earlier as a more extreme option, is this top left side of the map over here, because it allows you to get behind and see the spinners, which is why not letting the attackers get all the way over here is so important, because if they take this, then you are stuck in a line just walking into them, and that's really one of the worst things you can do. But this left side could be typically very powerful, especially if you can get an anchor weapon over here, who could then help to clear the plat area right below in order to retake. The main downside of this route, though, is if you're retaking and you're going this way, this is a long route. This is one of the longest retakes you can do if you're retaking this way. But trying to skip to the right side both here or even down here is incredibly risky due to the one-way drops and very defensive-favored terrain that exists in the middle of the map. So oftentimes, retakes on this map can be very tricky and very punishing if you mess it up. The exchange is that there's a lot of powerful positions for good defensive specials. Crab on these grates is one of the strongest positions for it in the entire game, and it's very easy to get set up in a lot of different parts of the map, both on spinner or on the sides of the stage, to really threaten approaches. So it's a stage that really takes a long time to move anywhere, but it compensates for it by having a lot of options and a large size of the stage that forces people to spread out. And that's also why, taking fights in the spinners can be really important, because you narrow down a lot of the terrain of the map, because being up here cuts off so much of the opponent's options. And that's where this route has to exist as a counterbalance to it, otherwise the map would feel too narrow. So, with all those being said, we've kind of already covered most of the plat area already. Let's talk about the middle of the map. I think the middle of the stage is pretty interesting. Typically, you want to try to get it set up on either sides, but it's really this area where it's difficult to mount a bit more of a push, because it's very easy to get pinned in this corner. This is kind of no man's land. It could be good for attackers if they're trying to ledge peek with something like a bucket or blaster. You'll see range blasters went there a lot before range got nerfed, for instance. But it's very tricky to be here as a defender. You can get backed into this corner a lot, especially if you take this position over here. And so if you're going to commit to the right side of the map, oftentimes it's important to have a plan to make it all the way over here. If you do actually secure this whole right plat, it can be very helpful. And this goes for when you're retaking as well. If you're on the defending team coming out of spawn and you manage to get a foothold over here, it's really good. But what the defenders have to do, holding mid, is try to keep you from getting the angle. Because the idea is if you take this angle wide enough, the attackers can only approach you, from this way. But if defenders are able to have someone hold, one of these off angles either over here or a more defensive weapon over here, you can still be in the corner. Even if you're able to get a defensive weapon in these kind of spots, you're still looking at a very poor angle. If an anchor backs up here, you're no longer going to have the threat of like a leader or pencil patrolling the enemy plat. So this flank is really the main thing that makes the stage interesting. It opens up a lot of different options, both defensively and aggressively, and it pulls attention away from the middle of the stage, which is something that I think a lot more Splatoon 3 stages need. When we talk about hallway maps, this is really the kind of thing that subverts that. And it's very rare to see that kind of terrain, as we'll see throughout this series. There's not going to be many routes where I can talk about it like this. But this is a genuinely really dynamic route. I think it's also good to drop with certain specials, like getting a bubble or crab over here can be very useful. Having an option like Booyah, all of that can be very strong. Spinner itself tends to not be somewhere you really want to be. If it's a more separated position where you have space, it's great for anchors. If it's up close, typically AoE weapons will be your best friend. Stuff like Bubble and Crab could also be good here, depending on similar situations as well. But typically you'll be seeing the approaches from the two sides like I talked about earlier, where you're trying to go over here and over here, where controlling the plats next to them are the most important thing, of course. So a lot of times it's going to be trying to get one of these sides and then put pressure on the other side to try and take space. The middle of the map is a death pit more than most death pits could ever be, because again, there's no real way back to either of your plats. So this is why the sides of the map become so important, because if you're an attacker and you need to go backward, that's it. Your only option is over here, and you have to make sure you can hold and win that fight. So if a team is ever able to get both of these side quadrants, they pretty much are going to win the fight almost immediately, because it's so powerful at restricting the enemy team's options. And the terrain in the middle of the map is just bad. You have a large, uninkable wall behind you with very limited room to go and very limited cover. One of the last things I'll say on this stage is I think the positioning for anchors is pretty dynamic. I think it's pretty cool how, anchors can try to get into one of these positions later on, depending on the side of the, which team you're on. Playing top mid is kind of interesting, and then plat has a variety of positions from here or over here. There's quite a lot of different spots for anchor weapons to go. Overall, I think Museum's actually a pretty interesting stage. It's definitely not as good as it used to be in its prime back in Splatoon 1, but I think it's a mostly faithful recreation, and honestly, it's a lot of fun to strategize and think about. It's definitely one where you have to be really careful in using different parts of the terrain, and it can have a lot of heavy choke points, while at the same time having some of the most interesting ways around hallway design that we have had access to so far. I think it's pretty interesting to look at it as a whole and see where it goes from here. But yeah, that's my thoughts on Museum.